Hello and welcome to Africa Here and Now, the conversation you've always wanted to have about the continent. I'm Martine Dennis. Today, what has Kenyan President William Ruto done to deserve a state visit to the White House? He's the first African leader to get the red carpet treatment in over 15 years. Tough times continue for journalists on the continent. They're beaten up, locked up and even killed. We speak to Nigerian investigative journalist David Hundeyin about why he fled his home country and became a refugee. By mid-century, almost half of the world's Christians will live in sub-Saharan Africa. How will that affect Christianity? A question for the eminent Anglican Bishop Trevor Mwamba. And we mark the 57th anniversary of one of the 20th century's most devastating civil wars. First, though, let's say hi to multi-talented Donu Kogbara, journalist, columnist and YouTuber in the Nigerian capital, Abuja. Hi, Donu.
Hi. Hello, everyone.
And Patrick Smith, editor of Africa Confidential. Patrick, let's start with the Kenyan president's state visit to Washington. What has William Ruto done to deserve this honour? It's the first time in, 16 years that an African leader has been given the red carpet treatment.
Greetings, everybody. It was momentous. I think you've got to bear in mind that Ruto has been on no less than 50 foreign trips since getting elected in August 2022. It's something of a record. And he's got a bit of a reputation for convening conferences. So last year, they had a big climate conference in Nairobi. They got all the big players. They got high-level delegations from China, from the US, from Europe, and so on. He then made a big splash at Emmanuel Macron's financial summit last year. And he shows up at the IMF World Bank meetings. Actually, just a month before this trip to Washington, he hosted this World Bank summit in Nairobi to try to raise money for the soft loan affiliate. So he's got a lot of form on this stuff. And cynics say that the economic situation in Kenya is so grim that the best thing Ruto can do is sort of strut the international stage and be seen with all these sort of heavy hitters. So that's really what happened. And then Biden also had his own problems to deal with, which is that the US troops are getting kicked out of Africa, particularly West Africa. So it's sort of a kind of symmetry that Ruto has exploited. And he's saying, right, okay, well, actually in East Africa, we still like the US. At least I like the US. He's also, I have to say, very adeptly went down to the Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, and then scored $150 million in private investment from Coca-Cola in Kenya as a kind of hub for Africa. So he's tried to make it worth Kenya's while.
Well, it's very interesting that Ruto has been given this very special non-NATO ally status. How do you account for that?
Yeah, that's kind of remarkable. It's being talked up a lot in the US. There are three other countries in Africa that have got that status: Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. And of course, Egypt and Tunisia, I think with the best will in the world, are not democracies. And actually, and in Tunisia's case, heading for sort of full-on autocracy. Morocco's kind of in the half-light, I guess. They're all, however, very adept at dealing with the US. And what you get out of this is special access to US kit. So the first tranche, I think Ruto's going to get 16 US helicopters, 150 armored vehicles from the US, and you get this sort of sobriquet as kind of US policeman in the region. So that's what Ruto gets out of it. And the US gets a kind of compensation for getting kicked out of West Africa.
Now, as you point out, I mean, he does have the nickname of the flying president, doesn't he? And he has been strutting his stuff on the world stage since his election victory. Somebody in the region, the East African region, said to me just yesterday that there's a new head prefect on the block, referring to Ruto. But you guys, both you and Donu, were in Kigali and you saw him up close and personal, as it were. How did he strike you?
Well, I thought he was quite impressive. Alongside Kagame, they both talked a very good talk, which impressed a lot of the Africans there. because they sounded dynamic, they sounded sincere, they sounded as if they wanted Africa to, enter a new dawn of self sufficiency and stop blaming everyone else for our problems. This is a message I've been banging on about all my life.
Right. And how did he interact with the other leaders there? Because this was the CEO forum, wasn't it, in Kigali?
Ruto was on the stage with Kagame, and it did look a bit like the master and his pupil, I have to say, because Kagame's been running Rwanda for the last 30 years and is still lauded in certain circles for being the kind of authoritarian that makes the trains run on time and gets the economy working. So Ruto's a slightly different model. He was he was elected in a very competitive election, and Kenya's a very raucous democracy compared to Rwanda. But you can see that Ruto's really using the Kagame playbook to kind of I'm not taking any rubbish from the West or the East. I'm my own man. And that's a message that goes down terribly well.
All right. Okay. Thank you both for that. Now we've had a bit of insight into William Ruto, the new head prefect. Now, as journalists, all of us, it's a commonly known fact that if you're doing your job well, you're not going to be liked by the authorities. We have to just take that on the chin. Our job is to ask uncomfortable questions and to hold public officials to account. Now, David Hundeyin has been doing just that, creating a tsunami of headlines that have revealed corruption, incompetence, and downright lies. And he's made a lot of enemies in his home country, Nigeria, as a consequence. And he's joining us now on the Africa Here and Now podcast. David, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start at the end, as it were. You felt compelled to leave the country. Tell us about that.
Well, there were several factors that contributed to that decision. But I guess the immediate factor that caused me to finally take that decision in November 2020 was a story that I did just about 2 weeks after the so-called Lekki massacre. If you recall, at the time, during the NSAS protests, the military massacre on unarmed civilians at the Lekki toll plaza in Lagos State, which effectively ended the protest movements, became a big issue. And the story that I worked on was a story which showed that the government had a premeditated intention to carry out the massacre, because the argument that was being thrown around at the time was that, yes, there may have been a massacre, but it wasn't premeditated. It just happened. So the story that I worked on showed that because the night of the massacre, there was an internet outage that affected nearly everyone in the immediate surroundings in Lagos. And the story that I worked on proved that the internet outage was in fact a planned event that was timed to coincide exactly with the massacre, which began at 6:50 p.m., which would then indicate that obviously this was a premeditated action. At the time I did this story, I knew that if I stayed in the country after doing this story, especially at a time when everyone who was known as someone involved in the protest movement was being targeted in some way, bank accounts were being frozen, people were being put on no-fly lists, all sorts of crazy things were happening. People were getting, picked up from home and detained. I knew that it was time to leave. I had been skirting the edge of this thing for a couple of years already at that point. I got threatened quite a few times.
What were the sort of threats, David?
Okay, so, there's one which I mentioned in my book. So I have an uncle who was, well, I'm not going to say his name, but I'm going to say his position. So up until quite recently, he was the Deputy Comptroller General of the Nigerian Immigration Service. So this is a very high-ranking person in the Nigerian security establishment. And this was in 2019. I was back home in Badagry for a family celebration, and he came to look for me specifically, someone who had never really spoken to me before. And he said it with a smile on his face, but he wasn't joking. He said, "We've been seeing the things you've been writing, and people in Abuja have been calling me and be saying, is that your son, or is that your nephew, whatever, that with these glasses of yours, do you know that you're not going to see what happens inside the underground DSS dungeon in Abuja? That do you know that the DSS headquarters has 7 underground stories of prisons? That by the time they pick you up, you're not going to see anything inside there." And there was a real menace in his voice when he said it. And then he walked away, and he hasn't said a word to me since then. So, yeah, and that's just one instance, right? So things like that had been happening. So at this point, I knew, okay, it's time for me to stop tempting fate. It's time for me to leave.
Yeah, David, can we just go back to the SARS issue? What happened to that movement? Because it was an amazing coming together of opposition forces in Nigeria. It seemed to be pretty spontaneous. It was predominantly, as I understand it, run by women around the Lagos area. And at one stage, it was clear that the government was seriously rattled. So I just wondered where that movement came to. And, when it came to the elections, were those people really represented, or they just checked out of politics?
It was a very decentralized protest. In fact, the protest didn't begin in Lagos, which is something that I think history has forgotten now. It actually began in Ughelli in Delta State, which is some 300 miles away from Lagos. Some yuppies, middle-class yuppies in Lagos, very successfully turned it into an advertising campaign for themselves. They got their faces on the front page of the New York Times or whatever. But there were no leaders. It was the first time I had seen such a thing in Nigeria, because every other significant protest movement that had existed in Nigeria was centralized in some way. There was some form of leadership. This was the first time that there was no such thing. And this directly led to what we witnessed last year during the Nigerian elections, where what we now know as the so-called obedient movement, I think it's now accepted as part of historical canon that the obedient movement was a direct descendant of the NSAS protest movement, because it was organized along the exact same principles, that there is no leadership. It's a loose confederation of people who broadly agree on a few key issues and will come together in a very sort of mob-like manner to fight for what they believe in. So I guess that answers the question, that what happened to them. They sort of morphed into a political movement which still exists, and which I'm hoping will come to play a bigger role in Nigerian politics moving forward.
Right. So you're painting a really, really distressing picture of the way journalists are being treated in Nigeria. And I see that the Committee to Protect Journalists have issued a very stern warning about security forces arresting journalists, transporting them across the country. And this is happening as we speak, no doubt. But also in Tunisia, we see that journalists are being locked up under draconian laws. At an MK rally in South Africa last week, as we know they're going to the polls this week, there were journalists, female journalists, at least one of them was sexually assaulted by the personal protection unit for Jacob Zuma. They assaulted at least 3 female journalists. Then you've got Bobby Wine's bodyguards. They're accused of roughing up 3 female journalists in Uganda. I mean, how would you assess the state of journalism on the continent generally, David?
So it's funny you asked that question, because a few days ago I did a sort of YouTube video about this exact issue, the state of journalism, not just how journalists are treated, but how journalism as a profession is even run in Nigeria. And my assessment is there are basically two types of journalism happening in Nigeria. So there's the state-dominated journalism, which isn't very useful to anyone, because it just pirates whatever the government decides is the reigning narrative of the day, which more often than not is simply not true. And then there's the journalism which tries to be independent, or which markets itself as independent, but its independence is hobbled by 2 major factors. So on the one hand, there's the corporate journalism, which is dependent on like advertising revenue from corporate partnerships and whatnot. It's very unlikely that you're going to get useful things out of that either, because the Nigerian corporate establishment is, hand and glove with the Nigerian political establishment. So there is not that much you can do. And I know this personally, I'm not just saying, because I've been in that space. So, I used to be a tri-weekly columnist with Business Day, which is Nigeria's biggest financial intelligence publication. And I know it got to the point where I literally had to stop writing for them, because there were certain things I could no longer get published. That's just how it works. And then on the other hand, those who aren't beholden to the corporate establishments have to get sort of non-profit grant NGO funding. But that doesn't also guarantee the needed independence, because where that funding is coming from also, to a very large extent, dictates what you can and cannot do as a journalist. So Nigeria is in this sort of very unfortunate situation now where I think, as far as I'm aware, I can't think of another country on the planet which has that quantum of people, 200 million people, and doesn't have one or two significant, genuinely independent, large scale national media platforms for journalism.
I mean, there was a time, wasn't there, David? Am I looking back with rose-tinted glasses? But there was a time in Nigeria, Kenya, they were renowned for having quite punchy, quite robust forms of journalism. I mean, what's happened? I mean, we are talking about 30 years ago.
Several things have happened. The first thing, obviously, was that the military establishment, which has morphed into a civilian establishment, but it's still the same people who are at the core of it. So it's a pseudo civilian establishment, attacked journalism, especially the business of journalism. It was attacked very frontally during the 80s and the 90s. As I was telling someone the other day, no A student in Nigeria who has the world ahead of them goes to study mass comm, which is like the entry, the university program that prepares you for a journalism career. That doesn't happen anymore. If you're an A student, you go study engineering or law or something that you have a future in. On the other hand, there has been an influx of NGO and grant money, a huge influx of it, where a few people have become relatively wealthy. So the period you described between the 70s and the early 90s, where you had your Dele Giwas and your Masebus and those people, those giants of investigative journalism at the time, that was a time when the platforms that they worked with, the likes of Concord newspaper, Punch newspaper, many of them, bear in mind, were also owned by politically exposed people who were part of the establishment, but for some reason or the other were not aligned with the establishment in power at that time. So because of that, they had the freedom to do certain things. The Nigerian establishment is a lot tighter now, so you can't really play off different parts of the establishment against each other.
Right. Donu, what's your experience like as a journalist operating in the environment that David has been describing?
Oh, well, I have a weekly column in a national newspaper called Vanguard. And there have been times when I've been told point blank that something I've written will not be published. For example, when Tinubu was going through all kinds of travails last year around his Chicago shenanigans, I was told to not even mention the word Chicago in my column because, I supported I supported Peter Obi, and I was given a fairly free hand during the election campaign. But after, when Tinubu was established as the winner, in inverted commas, I hasten to add, I was told to stop. And it's very disheartening. I mean, there are all kinds of stories going around about editors taking money from the government and blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's even that. I think it's self-censorship, because this is a dangerous place in which to be a truth teller. So, and there have been recently a couple of examples of editors being locked up for several weeks or days. So, and to be honest with you, there is this prevailing view that Nigeria isn't worth dying or suffering for. People are very reluctant to be the one who's going to make a fuss and keep on making a fuss. I have actually come to the conclusion that Nigerians do not actually deserve my activism. Or David's, for that matter, which is, of course, David's is far more intense than mine is.
Coming back to you personally, David, what sort of price do you think that you've paid for doing your brave and methodical and detailed journalism?
Well, again, I don't want to sound like I'm looking for anyone's sympathy, because I'm not. I knew what I was getting myself into when I did. No one asked me to do it. It was 100% my decision, and I knew what the potential risks were. But what I would say the biggest or the most unexpected cost has been is that I've discovered the extent to which a nation state has the capacity to complicate your life. Because I've spent a lot of time, in and around the security establishment. I mean, my dad originally in my childhood was a civil servant, a quite high ranking civil servant. I'm quite familiar with the inner workings of the Nigerian government. I have a lot of my family is in and around the Nigerian security architecture at all levels. So I'd always had this idea that I kind of understand the Nigerian state. I know what it can and cannot do. I know what capacity it has or doesn't have. And I've always been able to sort of stay out of its reach. But over the past year, especially, is when I've discovered the extent to which a government can absolutely destroy your life if it wants to. If you get your name onto a list as an enemy of state, it can really complicate your life.
What you're saying about Nigeria, and as Martin's pointed out, it's happening across the continent. It's happening actually across the world, let's be honest. But in terms of African journalists, what's the opportunity for independent journalists to organize, to do these sort of investigations and exposés? How do you think journalists can get together to have a really serious media impact on what's going on in multiple countries across the continent?
That's an excellent question, and that's a question I'm trying to answer. Over the past year, I spent a bit of time traveling around the continent. I connected with a few journalists that I feel I have some affinity with. And what I saw was that our hearts are all in the right place, but the singular and intractable issue that continues to be pervasive across all of our circumstances, self included, is the fact that outside of maybe getting this grant or something, there is no business model for it. There is absolutely no business model. So what I have been trying to canvass for, to campaign for among the generality of Nigerians is that people, your perspectives and your narratives need to be represented in the world, but nobody's going to do it for you, right? Because nobody else is going to fund it. So if there are 200 million of us, surely amidst that mass of humanity, we should be able to aggregate something to create some sort of storytelling resource for our benefits. That's what I tried to do with my Substack publication before I kind of got tired and stepped away from it, because in 2.5 years of running it, and I had over 55,000 subscribers in total, it became a very influential thing. But I had in total about, from Genesis to when I stopped, I had about 400 paying subscribers. And that's not 400 paying subscribers concurrently. That's 400 people who had ever bought a subscription. So at any given point in time, there might be 150 active subscriptions. So that's not really going to do much for you at the end of the day.
We sympathise. We sympathise here at Africa Here and Now. We know about that lack of funding.
I mean, you would.
But I mean, but David, do you get appreciation? I mean, from Nigerians, knowing that you're abroad, knowing how to reach you, do people say thank you for flying the flag?
Oh, that happens all the time. Like, even so, here in the UK, I can barely walk down the street sometimes because it's like every time I see a black face, there's a chance it's a Nigerian, and they always go like, "You are," and yeah, and then there's a whole thing that happens all the time. But the thing is, I feel like the point of doing this wasn't to become some sort of pseudo celebrity. Like, there's a goal that I was trying to achieve. That goal has not been achieved. So, and I think the people, like Nigerians, sort of need to see it as a shared goal and not see it as, oh, there's this Hercules who's going to fight the monster on our behalf. There is no Hercules. I'm not a hero.
Do you ever think that you will feel safe enough to return to your home country?
With the current circumstances, it's not looking very likely, but I hope it happens at some point because, again, yeah, everything I know is still there. But I've also made peace with the possibility that there's a very real chance that that may never happen. I think Africa is a very big continent. So even if I can't physically be in Nigeria, I think there are other parts of Africa where I have also made a sort of home for myself. I have friends, I have connections, I have actual places to live in all 5 regions of the continent now. I'm very proud of that. So, I will continue to do what I can for Nigeria, but if it's a place which becomes, too hot for me permanently, well, I guess I won't be the first person to be permanently exiled. It happens. And I don't feel sorry for myself.
David Hundeyin, Thank you, David. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. And David's book, by the way, is called Breaking Point, which is published by Abibiman. So, David Hundeyin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Right. There are more Christians in Africa than in any other continent. Latin America comes second, and then Europe is third. It's an estimated 718 million as of 2023. And by the middle of this century, it's reckoned that 40% of all Christians will live in sub-Saharan Africa. Right, let's talk now to Bishop Trevor Mwamba, who's had a prolific international career. He was Bishop of Botswana for 8 years, presided over the inauguration of President Ian Khama, and has had an array of senior positions in the UK. He is now President of the United Independence Party of Zambia, the oldest political party in the country, and of course formerly led by the one and only KK, Kenneth Kaunda. He's joining us now from Lusaka. You're actually in the cathedral, aren't you, Trevor?
Yes, I am, Martin. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross. I would say one of the most beautiful cathedrals in Africa. Yes, that's where I am.
Okay, well, I shall make a point of visiting it. Something significant is happening to Christianity. What sort of impact is the Africanization of it likely to have on the religion?
Well, that's a very good question. If I may, it goes back to the beginning of Christianity itself, really, the first century. If we go to the story as narrated in the Acts of the Apostle, the evangelist Philip was told to go to a road, Jerusalem, leading to Gaza, where he encountered what is described as the Ethiopian eunuch, who was the treasurer of the Queen of Ethiopia, Candace. So he's in a chariot, and he's reading this book of Isaiah, and Philip says to him, did he understand what he was reading? He said, no. So he began to explain. And basically what he explained was the gospel of Jesus. And the Ethiopian eunuch that came to this place where there was water, he said, look, I would like to be baptized. And he was baptized. And that's how the story begins. That's the root, the soil of Christianity in Africa. But then it goes on. You have the story of St. Mark, the story of St. Barnabas in the streets of Alexandria, Egypt, as missionaries. And then that gives that Christian presence. So what I tell people is that Christianity is not new to Africa. In fact, it has its roots, its DNA in the African soil. And later on, as the church began to be established, the church fathers, people like Tertullian, Origen, Cyprian, St. Augustine, these were the pillars of the African church as scholars, as teachers, as well as of the Western church. So there's the root. So the Africanization of Christianity is simply the expression of the true spirit of Christianity as it evolved in Africa and to the rest of the world.
Would you say that Africans are more spiritual than, say, Europeans or Asians?
Quite frankly, yes, indeed. I think there is a depth of an awareness that we see things in a much broader and sensitive way, a connection with the other world or other worlds, where others will want to bring a more rational approach, especially now. But we have never lost that sensitivity. So one would say, yes, as I said, the beginning of the early church and the teaching of the early church, you had these Christian African theologians who were expanding, giving the leadership to the rest of the world.
And is it because of the rise of these mega churches that are now dotted all over the continent and beyond there in Latin America as well? Is that the reason why the vast majority of Christians are going to be located on the African continent?
No, I don't think so. There's an interpretation of Christianity as we have seen it over the years and different contexts, the different environments. The mega church, there you are dealing with the prosperity gospel. It's all about money. It's religion being turned into a business, and using spirituality as the key. And of course, if you're very spiritual and you try to understand life through a spiritual angle, and con artists, as I'll call them, they use your faith to take money out of you. So of course it becomes, you're easily susceptible to that. So to that, in Africa there is that danger. Yes, of course, that now, of course, as the prosperity gospel goes, if you come to church, you come to my church, you shall get the job you want, you shall marry the person you want, you shall, you shall not suffer from illness. People easily get bought into that. So that has a way of increasing numbers, yes.
Many African countries are socially conservative. Therefore, how far are they going to be impacting Christian practice? Generally, I'm thinking about LBQT rights, which are being trampled on all over the continent. There's quite often punitive laws in place against gay people. Is that going to become mainstream Christian thinking and practice?
No, 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 no. You see, I hear what you're trying to get at, and here's the context again. It's importing, it's bringing in issues that other societies or environments may be passing through, and trying to impose that on African environment, which is totally different. The point is simply this: the issues that, say, may be facing the West are not the issues that Africa faces. But we are living in a global world where we assume, even in the context of Christianity, that the problems of the West are the problems the Africans face. Ours is a different approach. For example, I mean, the whole issue of the homosexual issues, when I was Bishop of Botswana, within the Anglican Church, as you'll be aware, there was a great debate, a great conflict within the Anglican Church with the ordination of, at the time, of Gene Robinson, who was an American bishop. And this threatened us to split the Anglican Communion. And my take at the time was that the issues that the American church was facing was not the issues that the African church were facing. So, for example, the issues of poverty in Africa, the issues of governance, the issues of HIV and AIDS at the time, the issue of child mortality, it is all about survival. And these are things we have to take cognizance of when we look at the spread of Christianity and what affects the African church. Again, the issues of, the debate on homosexuality, it's all about degrees. Homosexuality has existed in Africa, but how did we deal with it? How do we deal with it? People do know that lifestyles are there, but it is held and looked in a different context without, quite frankly, intimidating those who are so inclined. They're accepted.
Well, you say that Africans are deeply spiritual. I say they're deeply superstitious. I think there is a difference. I think, in my experience, Africans believe in almost anything. I mean, honestly, the belief in black magic exists alongside the belief in Christianity or Islam. In fact, I would go so far as to say that fewer Nigerians would lie in court if they were asked to swear on an animist oath rather than on the Bible or the Quran. The second thing I would say is that I don't think you can separate homosexuality, for example, from the issues that concern Africans. Of course, we are more concerned about issues like poverty, survival, etc. But homosexuality is part and parcel of some people's day to day existence. And I don't think you can brush it under the carpet and say, well, these are the problems that they have in other countries. They're not our priorities. Because in my experience, again, there are probably just as many gay people in Nigeria as there are in Western countries. They're just all married and in hiding.
Donna, I totally hear you, but here's the context again, which I'm trying to put clearly. Being superstitious, spiritual, you find it everywhere. Even in the West, there are people who worship satanic, and this is a very, advanced scientific society, if you like. So human beings are human beings. People believe what they believe. That It's a question of what do you believe. So we can't just sweep under the carpet and say the Africans are therefore primitive and if they believe that. No. But the issue which you
No, but you see, the thing is, let me tell you something interesting, sir. What I've noticed about white people, I mean, in Europe and the States, by the way, I'm totally opposed to Pentecostal Christianity, but that's another story for another day. The prosperity gospels, as you talk about, totally opposed. But when I've noticed that, I'd say that like the average English person is essentially Christian in their sort of like DNA and their sort of instincts. They may not go to church and they may not even mention God ever, but I just find that they're more fundamentally in tune with Christianity than people in Nigeria where I live. I mean, here it's all blood of Jesus. Everybody must go to church every Sunday, vigils, and all the rest of it. I find that there are more fundamentalist animists here.
Here's the context. You see, for me, Christianity or whatever faith one may subscribe to, it could be a Muslim, it could be a Hindu, it could be a Buddhist, and so forth. It all comes down to this. And this is what I think is the depth of our deep African spirituality, what we call Ubuntu or Ubuntuism. This is the context of I am because you are. It's how we treat each other, that we are humans, we respect each other. It is helping one another. It's this community sense of fellowship. So you are never an orphan in Africa in the traditional context. There are no orphans because you have what we call the extended family. So it's a question of how we treat each other. And then in the end, that's what Christianity is about. That's what Islam is about. That's what all true faiths try to point to. It's the importance of the person. And I think having that an awareness and understanding is very important. And in this context, from an African context, I say that's not anchored on the fact that you're a human being. It's anchored in the awareness that there is a greater being than us to whom we subscribe, to whom we believe, and who teaches us how to honor one another and how to behave towards one another.
So you don't find where you come from, people don't do ancestor worship then?
Well, what do you mean ancestor worship? Describe ancestor.
Because everybody here does, more or less.
Here's my understanding of ancestor worship in the context of the Christian faith. It is what we call the reverence of the saints in the Catholic traditions, Anglican tradition, Orthodox tradition. We honor the saints. The saints are those human beings, men and women, who have lived exemplary lives, good lives, and who we seek to emulate and follow in their footsteps. So, in the African context, if you say ancestor worship, it's to say they are those ancestors who also exemplified good lives. Even if the naming in some of the African traditions, when you are given a name, they seek a name that has value, that has, of your grandmother or your great great grandmother, so that you follow in that footstep. So the worship of ancestors is the reverence of models who we want to emulate. That's what it is. But if somebody comes from another context and country and says you're worshiping ancestors, then you take it hook, line, and sinker and say, yes, I am, but you're not. I'm trying to say how we must define this in context of our.
Bishop, can I ask you a broader question about church and state? We talked on the LGBTQ thing a bit earlier, but the broader issues, it seems that, in most Western Christian countries, they try to, especially in France, they try to draw a big distinction between church and state. And there's this conflict in France, between that dominant view and the Islamic view, which is religion is politics and politics is religion. Even in the sort of non-Islamist movements, they're kind of Sufi movements and so on. But once you get into the Islamist movements, it's part of the doctrine. Is that, I mean, are we seeing a kind of Christian response to this in the kind of religious right in America saying, actually, yeah, we would agree with the Muslims on one thing. Yeah, politics is religion and religion is politics. And are you worried about that trend of politicizing Christianity?
No, I'm not too worried about it. It's a question of interpretation. It's a question of understanding. Here's my view. I don't draw a line actually between church and politics. For me, it's all one. And this is the context that how to explain it. There was a French poet and religious thinker, Charles Peguy, and he has a great poem, one of them, God's Dream. But Charles Peguy once said that everything begins in mysticism and ends in politics. And basically, what he meant, and this is my understanding of that, is if you look at the Christian faith itself, if you look at Jesus, it's to say that God is love. Everything begins with God, who is love. And the expression of that love, in terms of fighting injustice, in terms of inclusivity, in terms of helping the poor, the expression of that is politics. So anybody who is hooked to the love of God becomes a politician. Everything in life is politics. So it's a question of understanding what it means. And of course, there are many interpretations.
I'd like to ask you on a more practical level, given the number of Africans that are now signed up, are we more likely to see, for instance, more Africans at the top of the hierarchy? A black pope, for instance, a pope from Africa.
I'm trying to recall here. Early popes would have been an African who was in England. The name escapes me. But yes, it will be. It will be very soon. And of course, having said all that, I've been recently in England. You had the Archbishop of York, Johnson Tamu. I mean, he just missed it by the skin of his teeth. He would have become the Archbishop of Canterbury. We've got great African leaders within the church, the likes of Desmond Tutu.
And what do you think of today's environment and landscape in terms of Christian values? How would Jesus fare in 2024?
Oh, Jesus, when he was born, Mary, Joseph, Jesus, they were refugees. Off they went to Egypt. They were refugees. I would think that in 2024, if Jesus had to flee and would have fled to England because of his immigration policies as it stands now, he would have been most likely put on a plane flying off to Rwanda. So the point is, we have lost our humanity, we have lost our compassion. We need to treat each other with that sense of respect and compassion, inclusivity. Let us see how we can create a world that is fair, that is inclusive, that is compassionate and understanding. And that's the Christian understanding and the message of the church and the message of politics, of any true leaders who must stand up to make our world a fairer place.
Bishop Trevor Mwamba, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So, as we say thank you and goodbye to Trevor Mwamba, Donu, it's 57 years since the declaration of a Biafran state in the east of Nigeria. How's this anniversary marked? And the reason why I'm asking you, of course, is because you have a direct family connection to this event.
Yes, well, my father was the Biafran ambassador or representative in London during the Civil War. And my mother and my siblings and myself had to flee from Port Harcourt, which is our hometown, as the federal troops advanced on Port Harcourt. So we had to, as they advanced, women and children were, moved out. And we went on the run, basically, and were refugees for a short while before we were airlifted out to join my father in the UK. I've always felt guilty about that because so many people who stayed behind died.
Right. So how is the anniversary generally marked in Nigeria? For instance, I mean, you're in the capital, Abuja.
I'm not aware of anything special coming up. I'm sure that there must be something, but Biafra has been given a bad name to some extent by a new group called IPOB, which is a sort of like new group of young Biafra aficionados and their leader is in prison at the moment, Nnamdi Kanu. So I would say there's an old Biafra comprising people like me and my parents, most of the old Biafran leaders are dead, and their children are quite long in the tooth like myself. And then there's a new Biafra, which is the younger people who decided to take up the cause. I don't see much synergy between the old and the new. I'm not aware that there's anything going on. There might be privately, or there might be gatherings to which I've simply not been invited. But you see, Biafra is a bit of a dirty word in Nigeria today. It hasn't done the Igbos any good. The Igbo tribe was the main mover and shaker around Biafra, even though people like myself, who are from the Niger Delta, families like mine were also involved. But it was primarily an Igbo struggle. And the Igbos have suffered so much for the role they played, the secessionist rebellion. And I think I hope I'm being fair when I say that there is a reluctance nowadays to make a big deal of the anniversary because they've suffered enough from being associated with Biafra.
Thank you, Donny. Thank you very much for that. That's it for this edition of Africa Here and Now. This is the bit where I have to ask you to subscribe and share our YouTube channel. We really need the clicks. If you like the conversations we're having and fancy making a donation, www.AfricaHere&NOW.com is where you can. There you can also listen to all of our episodes. We're available on all major audio platforms as well as on your smart speaker. Just ask it to play Africa Here and Now podcast. Follow us on the socials. We're on Instagram and Facebook. I'm on X at Martine Dennis. Get in touch. We recorded this on Monday, the 27th of May, 2024. Our producer is Anne Busby. Our original music is by Enric Adam. Charlie Pantern and Tevin Sudi put everything together. Our thanks to our guests, David Hundeyin and Bishop Trevor Mwamba. From Donu, Patrick and me, thank you for your company.